Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Kevin Arlick, and I am a professor here at Georgetown, and I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Academic Programs. Um, and I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming you all to this event. I'm here basically on behalf of our interim dean, Josh Teitelbaum, who's on a flight and couldn't be here. But on behalf of Josh and the entire Georgetown community, it's just great to welcome you here for such a great event, exploring the themes in Danielle Allen's wonderful new book, Radical Duke, How One Aristocrat and the American Revolution Transformed Britain. We're especially delighted to be hosting this in cooperation with the Association of Marshall Scholars. You all know, one of the most prestigious fellowship programs in the world. We have several alums on our faculty, so it felt like a good match. And also just because of the association's commitment to fostering knowledge, expertise, and this sense of an enduring transatlantic friendship. I think that fits really well with Georgetown's values. So we're delighted to be partnering together. So I'm here in my official capacity as Associate Dean. This is purely a ceremonial role. But when you give a law professor the opportunity to speak, be prepared for them to seize it. So I just couldn't help myself. I am personally delighted about this because I happen to be a historian of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. You don't get a lot of woohoos for that, so that's great. So really, there's just two qualities of this book that I wanted to highlight, especially for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to read it, and it just came out. One is the incredible research that went into it over the course of, I think, of more than a decade, right? Professor Allen did incredible work, really marrying some of the latest technology, natural language processing, with just good old-fashioned, time-intensive work in the archives, digging through these sources and uncovering these transatlantic connections in ways that I think we hadn't known about before. I really want to know how she got access to the Duke's magnificent personal library. There's some kind of trick that I think I need to learn about to get that kind of access. And the second thing I want to highlight is the book's insistence that we consider the American Revolution as part of a broader transatlantic and even global reimagination of the relationship between the people and their institutions of government. I think Professor Allen's not the first person to situate the American Revolution in its international context, but I think her revelations about how its radicalism was presaged and perhaps inspired by the democratizing views of people like the Duke of Richmond in England serves as a welcome inspiration for us to think critically about our present historical moment. There are a lot of people, many in this very city, who want the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence to be celebrated as an exclusive and perhaps exclusionary American story. But I hope that Professor Allen's tale of how people forged alliances across borders and oceans to promote democracy and self-government serves as an invitation for us to do the same, which I take it is why we're here today. So without further ado, I just want to quickly introduce our moderator, my colleague, Sheryll Cashin. Sheryll is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice here at Georgetown, and I think she's the perfect interlocutor for us. Like our discussants, she is a Marshall alum, and she's an accomplished scholar and author. She's written a number of prize-winning books. I won't list them all, but I'll note her forthcoming book is very much a work of history. Yay, woohoo! Exploring how Black Americans and their allies perfected democracy. So thank you for being here, and join me in welcoming Sheryll, and she'll do the introductions for the rest of our panelists up here.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for getting us started and for helping approve this. Thank you to my colleagues. I'm not going to start naming names, but it's Josh and John for coming. I am just delighted to open this program. I want to begin I'm sort of wearing two hats. I'm a Georgetown Law faculty, but I'm a Marshall Scholar alum. Raise your hand if you're a Marshall Scholar. Yay, Marshall Scholars rule. Yeah, the two of us studied at Oxford in my day. I tell this joke at Marshall events all the time, but it's true. In my day, the Marshalls were the scholars at Oxford that finished their degrees. Nerds rule.
I eventually finished my degree, just for the record.
There you go. See? But the Marshall Scholars Association I wants to thank Georgetown and all of you for being here. I'm wearing that hat right now. How many of you saw King Charles mention the Marshall Scholars in his address? Did you see that? Yeah. So he was the patron saint when he was Prince Charles of the Marshall Scholars. And for all of us, for me personally, and I gather, I'm sure for every other Marshall Scholar here, that was a transformative experience in our lives. And so I'm happy to be here, and I'm thrilled now with all of the programming. It's just great. I hope all of you are getting your newsletter, donating to the association, and participating in the programming. With that, I'm going to introduce Danielle Allen. She's the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard. She's a political philosopher whose current research focuses on democracy renovation, how to connect citizens to civic power through education and institutional redesign, how to make political institutions more responsive and participatory. She's the director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and the director of the Democratic Knowledge Project Learn at the Graduate School of Education. She's a prolific author. This is your 12th book, I think. I counted. Numerous books. Winner of numerous awards. I won't list them all. I'm sure you probably, I don't know how people feel about being called a MacArthur genius, but you are a MacArthur genius. A candidate for governor in Massachusetts, but most importantly for this audience, a Marshall Scholar. Derek Kilmer is Senior Vice President for U.S. Program and Policy at the Rockefeller Foundation, where he leads the foundation's new economic opportunity agenda, helping communities navigate economic and technology disruption, connect more people to good jobs, keep jobs that they have, or keep employment, and change the systems that shape economic opportunity. He is here in his personal capacity. His remarks do not represent the views of the Rockefeller Foundation. He served 6 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives from Washington State, where he focused on economic opportunity and helped pass landmark economic development legislation supporting distressed communities. Very relevant for this discussion, he chaired the Select Committee on Modernization of Congress and advanced more than 200 bipartisan recommendations to help Congress function more effectively, given institutional strain. That's quite the euphemism. And declining public trust. He also served in the Washington State Legislature. So to get started, I'm sure that I've seen a couple of books in the audience, but I wanted to ask some questions that give people context, assuming that many will not have read the book. And I have to say, I learned so much as a constitutional law scholar who read law at Oxford. I thought I knew a fair amount about the British Constitution, but it just blew me away, your research and your finds. But tell us what brought you to this project. Why were you compelled to spend a decade of your life excavating the hidden story of this person who I'd never heard of, the radical Duke? And let's start there. And then I'm going to ask you why you view him as a radical.
All right, great questions. Well, I mean, I'll tell you why, and what everybody will take away from that is that Danielle has a kind of obsessive personality. So I wrote a book a little more than a decade ago about the Declaration of Independence. The second sentence of the Declaration is what Abraham Lincoln called the golden apple, right? Sort of set in a frame of silver. The Constitution is a frame of silver that holds the golden apple in place. And for this to make sense, I have to just remind you of what that second sentence is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All right, quick quiz. How many people remembered it was that long, that sentence? Right, most people don't realize that. And the reason is because July 1776 in Philadelphia, there was this rogue newspaper printer in town. He wanted to make a quick buck by printing stuff faster than everybody else. And somehow or other, nobody knows how, somebody slipped him a copy of the Declaration of Independence before the official printer, John Dunlap, put it in his newspaper. And so by 2 days, he beat Dunlap. This guy was named Benjamin Town. And apparently he thought that sentence was too long. And so he put a period in it after pursuit of happiness. Now, the whole sentence moves from our individual rights of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness to the fact that we build governments to secure those rights and together work to affect our, plural, safety and happiness. The whole arc of the argument is from I to we. It's essentially a communitarian account of what the project of self-government and constitutional democracy are. But with the period, everybody stops reading at pursuit of happiness and they think it's just a story of individual rights. This is just the beginning of the answer to your question. All right, so so that period, that it showed up there. Unfortunately, it's also the National Archives transcript of the Declaration of Independence. So when people go to get a transcript to read the Declaration of Independence, they often get a version where they stop reading after pursuit of happiness. They do not hear the whole arc of, again, the golden apple, the thing that is our most important philosophical inheritance, our inheritance of principle in this country. And so I became quite obsessed about this mistake, and I wanted to get it corrected. I wanted the National Archives to fix its transcript. And so as a part of doing that, this was obsessive project number 1, I assigned my research team to find every copy of the Declaration of Independence that had been created between 1776 and 1826. So I could figure out where the period came from. I figured out it was Benjamin Town, and I wanted to figure out like which versions had gone where. You'll be interested to know that Town's version circulated to the south, and Dunlap's version, which was correct, circulated to the north. Just an interesting little detail in this sort of historical inquiry. Anyway, in the process of looking for every single version that had been created, my research team stumbled on a ceremonial parchment of the Declaration of Independence in southern England in a tiny little record office called the West Sussex Record Office. It's the kind of place you would go for your marriage license or your birth certificate, that kind of thing. Now, when we found it, the world thought that there was one ceremonial parchment, and it's in the National Archives. So we were stunned and confused to find another one in southern England. And now, when you find something like that, you got to figure out how it got there, right? So I ended up writing this book because the answer to how it got there is this character, Charles Lennox, the third Duke of Richmond, who was the sort of aristocrat who held political sway over southern England in the period of time, and he was an ardent supporter of the Americans. He was the first member of Parliament to recommend acknowledging American independence. He introduced a bill for universal manhood suffrage in the House of Lords in 1780. England didn't get there for another 130 years or so. So he was radical in his politics, and sort of trying to figure out how the parchment had come to him required sort of excavating this whole story of a sort of network of political radicals that had disappeared from view.
Okay, so what makes him most radical, and it is absolutely radical to be supporting universal manhood suffrage in 1780, right? As a common law teacher, and I'm very aware that our founders were very uncomfortable with pure democracy and democracy itself, right? So they, those who suffered through common law with me know we deal with the separation of powers, and the design was to have representative democracy, but not too much. But reading your book, the impression I got but he was radical, but he was an aristocrat. So he's radical in that he wants the common man to have a vote, but he seems to expect that his class is going to be the ruling class, both in the House of Commons and certainly as peers in the House of Lords. Am I right about that?
Well, I mean, certainly, the House of Lords. I mean, he has, he's also closely connected to Edmund Burke. Lots of people don't realize that Burke was a radical, is in the 1750s, 1760s. It's not till the French Revolution that he sort of really becomes more conservative in his political accounts. But Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, the Duke of Richmond, they were all part of a single circle of radicals. And Burke actually was the person who really articulated frequently to the Duke a sense of sort of the special responsibility that aristocrats had. And here, it wasn't really sort of out of the norm. The Duke studied with Montesquieu when he went on the Grand Tour. Montesquieu was one of his father's best friends. He's like, go visit your dad's best friend. It happens to be Montesquieu. So he gets, good education. And of course, Montesquieu is also interested in kind of balanced forms of government, right? Where there's a role for aristocrats, just as there's a role for the common person. So yes, so there is that kind of sense of the great oaks of the land, as Burke referred to aristocrats, and the responsibility they had for kind of providing, a root system, a sort of stabilizing anchor for society. But I don't think he expected them to dominate the House of Commons. I think that he, was perfectly content to see as a popular house.
And I promise I'm going to bring you in, but there are a number of things I want to get at. Okay, so let's get out for the historians in the room some of the important historical finds, how you made these connections, particularly, he was not just radical in his imagination, but he was radical in his methods. So can you bring out, some of the findings that historians are going to drool over, that made these connections, particularly his connection with Thomas Paine, but how you went about solving this, because he purposely burned all his letters. He did not want people to know about his machinations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, all right. Okay, I have this parchment. I got to figure out where it came from. First thing we figure out is it had come to the archive through the solicitors, the legal offices of the Duke of Richmond. So that was a pretty good sort of straightforward start to this. And now I had a character, the Duke of Richmond, who had these connections to America. But what exactly made him so closely connected to America that he could end up with what is one of the most significant artifacts of the Revolutionary era and period of the Constitutional Convention? And here, fate intervened. I learned something that I should have already known as a historian, but I didn't know. I learned from a London cabbie, okay? And what I learned was that Thomas Paine had worked as an excise officer, a tax collector in Lewis, the same county as the Duke, Sussex, from 1768 to 1774. So that was sort of the moment where it's like, oh my goodness, if Thomas Paine was that close to the Duke, and the Duke was the Lord Lieutenant for the county, that means Paine worked under his jurisdiction, and they absolutely were involved in the same political circles and the like. Suddenly I had such a live connection of the Duke to the sort of actual stuff of the Revolution that my hunch was like, this had to be the answer. And then that's when the second obsessive project came in, right? I had to try to find a smoking gun connecting the Duke and Thomas Paine. I could put them, in the same election meetings, in the same sort of horse race parties and so forth, but I couldn't put them actually talking to each other or sharing anything and so forth. And while I was trying to kind of figure out, could they have crossed paths, what started to come to the surface was the fact that both of them had been deeply involved in this milieu of radical writers, and writers who were starting to write incredibly critical things of the king, even seditious things against the king. And in the course of figuring this out, I did have the pleasure of working in the Duke of Richmond's library. So the current dukes gave me access to the family library, which is still the beautiful 18th century library, and it's sort of equivalent to Thomas Jefferson's library.
Did they give you access just because you asked?
Pretty much. Oh, so that's the
secret.
Answer.
Just ask.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So I asked, anyway, I won't bore you with the details, but it did boil down to just ask, essentially, and they said yes. They're curious about their own history, in all honesty, so they were actually quite grateful that a researcher was interested. And the point here is just that in the library, there was a pattern of the Duke obviously owning the many pseudonymous or anonymous pamphlets of radical writers of the period. And some of these have inscriptions in them dedicated to the Duke. And I looked at them all, and they're anonymous and pseudonymous. And I just sort of like made a list of the titles and came back to them now and then. And one of them had a very lengthy dedication. And I looked at it, went on my way and so forth. And I say it this way because what I'm trying to communicate is a certain kind of blind spot that I brought into the process that was sort of an example of the kinds of blind spots historians get. Thomas Paine, when he came to America in 1774, about 13 months later, January 1776, he published Common Sense, which, as you all know, was one of the sparks for the American Revolution, this incredibly polemical pamphlet arguing that the Americans should throw off monarchy and sort of pursue their own independence and Republican form of government. And he always told people that it was the first thing he'd ever written. Now, if you're like me, I read Common Sense, I'm like, that's a really good first book. Like, really? But well, he said so. So I go on my merry way. So the point of that is to say that literally I looked at this pamphlet with this extensive dedication to the Duke for like 3 years without even asking the question, could that be Thomas Paine's handwriting? But then as the sort of pieces got closer and closer together, I realized the content of the pamphlet was precisely a set of themes that Paine had been obsessed with at the same period of time. So finally I was like, is that Thomas Paine's handwriting? And sure enough, got a letter, compared it. It was Thomas Paine's handwriting. And sent it to the experts, the people who do the collected edition of Paine, and they confirmed it was Thomas Paine's handwriting. And so lo and behold, there I had a book published by Thomas Paine in 1771 in England, when he supposedly had not published anything before, Common Sense in 1776. So that was kind of an extraordinary kind of jaw-dropping moment. And that was then the smoking gun that made it possible to put all the rest of the pieces together. And it turns out essentially the reason Thomas Paine told everybody he hadn't written anything before he came to America was because he spent 20 years writing seditious stuff in England, and he didn't want to be in legal trouble for it, right? Just sort of as simple as that.
And Richmond was at the center of this. He was the patron, right? He was paying these guys to write anonymous, seditious pieces to put pressure on King George to stop the patronage and the corruption and all of this. And yet he was a monarchist. I mean, he really did believe
in the 1780s. I mean, so in the 1770s, so for those of you who are historians, in the 1770s, you could be really critical of the king. So in the 1760s, King George really expanded and consolidated the power of the monarchy. And people in Britain objected to that just as much as people in the colonies did. So there was a kind of continuous conversation on both sides of the Atlantic about an overreaching, overweening, excessive executive power. And people wanted to rebalance the Constitution. And that meant, and this is where we'll really get to the congressman, trying to actually achieve legislative supremacy, get Parliament independent from the king again. Too many members of Parliament were in the pocket of the king. They got stipends from him and sinecures of various kinds. And this meant, from the point of view of Richmond and others, that the country was going off the rails because you didn't have the kind of independent voice of Parliament steering policy. It was collapsing into the will of the king. So many people objected to this, and they wanted to get rid of corruption. They also wanted to deal with the problem of rotten boroughs, basically the 18th century version of gerrymandering. And so they had sort of various reform projects to kind of claim power back from the king. And in that period in the 1770s, you could be critical of the king without clarifying whether or not you were a Republican who wanted to end monarchy or somebody who just wanted to modernize the monarchy, right? It could just be completely ambiguous. But once the American Revolution ended and the United States of America existed as a free republic, you had to choose. Now, if you were a reformer, you were either a Republican or you had to figure out a way to think about how to be a monarchist. And so he made a choice in 1783, and he chose a modernized monarchy with a limited executive.
Right. Okay. I have one final question before I come to you. All right. So thank you for plugging my current effort, Kevin. For 3 years, I've been writing about the people I claim as my founders, and my standard is that they were anti-slavery in their time. That's my standard. So the whole time I'm reading
John Adams.
We can have a conversation, but he was never an abolitionist. He was anti-slavery in his personal morals, but he actually voted against the gradual abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. So he wasn't willing to expend any political capital on it. Okay, but we're not here to talk about but of course, as I'm reading your book, radical, right? And then you mention Granville Sharp, you mentioned William Wilberforce, and I'm like, okay, this stuff is going on. The Somerset case is going on, but I'm not going to get, there's a spoiler. You have to get to the last 4 pages to see something. You have to buy the book and read it. But I associate the word radical with people who were willing to be anti-slavery. Ben Franklin gets there. I never could tell where your hero was. Can you say
Sure.
where he stood on there was a movement to abolish the slave trade and later a movement to abolish slavery. Where did he fit in that?
So for starters, I mean, the word radical is simply the word that historians use and was used in the time to apply to a set of people who were making these arguments about constitutional reform, right? So in that regard, it has a meaning that's specific to its period that is sort of different from our meaning. Richmond was supportive of the abolitionists in the 1770s and 1780s, in that sort of period when he was working closely with Granville Sharp and William Wilberforce. So there was a tight and positive connection at that time. And then he abandons that support, as you know. So I won't,
we're not going to give it away.
Spoiler.
It is
a devastating moment when that happens, for sure. So yeah.
Okay, Derek, you spent more than a decade of your life as a reformer in Congress, trying to modernize the House, make it more responsive to the people and the common good. Danielle's book treats us to a withering account of just how difficult that is, radical or not. So I'd like you to start by sharing what the takeaways for you were of this book.
First of all, I don't know about the rest of you. I am gleeful to just sit and listen, talk about your books. I wrote a children's about berries, which has not yet been published. But first of all, I want to thank Danielle. Exactly. I'll read you my berry children's book. I want to thank Danielle for writing a 444-page book that made me feel better about my decade as a reformer in Congress. I spent 12 years in Congress, 10 trying to really focus on making the institution better, in part because it turns out the Duke spent 30 years on reform and didn't live to see most of it happen. And let's be honest, misery loves company. So one of the things that I actually really appreciated, so I got involved in congressional reform in kind of an unusual way. I would, you'd have a week where you'd go, oh my God, what is going on? And then I'd plane to fly home. And once I finished all of the assigned work, I would write like, these are things, sorry, did I do something wrong? Okay, I broke it. Okay. I would write, this seems kind of broken, and, I would think about what I would do to fix it. This in my office became jokingly known as the Kilmer Manifesto, which is a little creepy, but we ended up turning it into something called the House Renovation Project, which I did not realize I had stolen from a Duke 250 years earlier. Now I broke her mic. All right.
We're going back and forth because I use the democracy renovation language. I was using that for years before I found it in his letters. So I didn't know either that I had stolen it from him.
Yeah. So I stole it from either the Duke or Danielle Allen.
You maybe.
But I actually think that's, so when we kicked off the committee, part of the discussion was Congress is a fixer-upper, but it's not a teardown, right? Like, this is a renovation project. And like, that's actually important, right? Because it is neither a choice to defend inadequate status quo, nor is it a burn it all down. It's actually the harder path, which is, actually doing the difficult work of reform. I think the main things I took away from the book is reform is a long game for stubborn people. And stubbornness is an underrated value in democracy, right? Because if you think about, some of you worked on the Hill, like almost, and entirely by design. Very little happens quickly, right? So patience or stubbornness really matters. Secondly, the Duke understood that you can't reform an institution only from the inside. You actually had to have the voices of the people pushing. And I think that too, and we saw that in some of the work that we were able to get done. And I think it is one of the things that we need, and the importance of books like Danielle's book, because I think part of the effort of change is going to require, it's like a physics equation, right? It's substantial force over time leads to change. And my final takeaway is maybe strangely one of relief, in that he burned his records because it was unsafe to be a reformer. Say what you will about our current system, and I have a lot to say about our current system. We are very lucky that we still have the right to push for change without having to hide the fact that we're pushing for change. And I think part of me felt like the fact that we get to do this work in the open is a gift that we shouldn't waste.
Right. No, I took that same lesson from the book too.
Just to give further context for the audience, and this was something that really did impress me about the Duke. So he's a peer in the House of Lords. He goes in and out of government. He gets these, he was a Secretary of State to France, like something. It was ambassador to France. I mean, he had a couple of different ministerial positions. We don't have to get to the titles, but he often was frustrated. And the problem was faction in the House of Commons, particularly. There was faction, but the main reason they couldn't get reform was because the king, through patronage, would basically pay people in the House of Lords, in the House of Commons, and give them jobs and things to stay in his column. So it was very, very hard. And that was the frustration. And so he just started saying, well, I want to start playing this outside game. And that's what led him to start paying radicals like Thomas Paine to start writing anonymous things, openly criticizing, So that was part of his game.
I will say, I mean, that was one of the most fun parts of working on the book, was sort of discovering this massive history of organizing, which has been basically overlooked by most historians. I mean, some people have had a little bit of awareness of sort of a round of organizing in 1778 to 1780, but for the most part, not at all. And here, I just want to share, I mean, one of the interesting things for me about working on this book is that during the time of it, 10 years, I also did the crazy thing in the middle of that time period of running for office in my own state of Massachusetts. And, it's a completely different line of work than being a scholar or a professor. And you learn completely different kinds of things and you see different things. So what really happened with that portion of the book was that I just noticed these little teeny references to the Duke being at this random meeting and then the Duke being at that random meeting, like 3 different random meetings. And nobody else had ever paid any attention to his being at these meetings. But I was like, wait a second, like there's a pattern in those meetings. Like he's organizing. And so, would not have been seeable for me if I hadn't myself been trying to drive change through politics. So I just want to kind of name that about the sort of strangeness of if being a scholar, trying to write about politics, it makes a difference to have, to some extent, in fact, tried to practice it.
So Derek, do you have a question for Danielle? About anything, but particularly about the challenge of reform now?
I think there's been more attention to the renovation project over the years. We were talking in just as we were waiting to come up that one of my other takeaways is it is not a sprint, right? And it's not even a marathon. It's like a marathon that's a relay race, right? Like that you have to hand the baton, and like I'd love to hear you because the reforms, he didn't live long enough to see many of his reforms. I actually think it'd be helpful for you to talk a little bit about the passing of the baton and how that worked and how some of that change ended up manifesting sometimes years on after the initial push.
Extraordinary story. And this was also another piece of the story that was powerful for me. I will tell the story of the 18th century in a moment, but let me just put it also in our own context. I now find myself often saying to people, Ida B. Wells recorded all those lynchings because she knew that unless she could document what was happening, it would never change. And she never saw the fruits of her labor, right? And to me, that's just the most kind of powerful and compelling thing, that you have to be, if you're a reformer, you have to be committed to posterity. You have to believe in the next generation. Therefore, you also have to work on intergenerational and cross-generational collaborations so that you can prepare to pass on the baton. And that's really, what the Duke was doing. I mean, so he was a radical in that other people were interested in solving the problem of rotten boroughs. I will pause on that one for a second just to explain what it means. Population shifted over the course of the 18th century in Britain. And so rural places that had population had shrunk. So famously, Old Sarum was a village that by the 1770s had 6 residents and 2 members of parliament, while Manchester by then had 30,000 residents and 0 members of parliament. Okay, so that's the rotten boroughs problem. And so many people wanted to broaden the suffrage to solve that, but mostly, wanted maybe a couple of reps for Manchester, or maybe a couple more reps for the counties they happened to be connected to, or maybe wanted to broaden it, but only if you had a certain kind of property qualification. Whereas the Duke said, like, every single man, regardless of whether he has any property or not. And so that was, an incredibly radical thing. And so what went with that in his actual just sort of way of being in the world was a true openness to talent in a variety of places. So Thomas Paine was a corset maker, and then he was an excise officer. And, the Duke was perfectly comfortable being a, partner with him in work. And so the Duke was really impressive for spotting talented working men and then forging these essentially cross-class coalitions as well. And in the same way that he spotted talented people outside of his own class cohort, he also spotted talented people outside of his generational cohort. And so he, before other members of the House of Lords, did things like support William Wilberforce when he was a sort of really first arriving member of Parliament, and supported, really importantly, William Pitt the Younger when he first came to Parliament. And so becomes a sort of network of younger men who are quite interested in the reform ideas. And so in this critical moment after the American Revolution, where Britain is really on the edge, it gets very tumultuous, governments keep collapsing, there's riots all over the place, there really is a question of whether or not it's actually going to collapse in its institutional form. The king is desperate. He's gone cycle through ministers. There's literally nobody who can do the job. And so he turns to William Pitt Jr., who is, I believe it's 24 years old when he is appointed prime minister. Okay, think of that, 24-year-old prime minister. And his government would not have worked if it weren't for the fact that the Duke of Richmond decided to stay in government. Everybody else was quitting, not willing to work under a 24-year-old prime minister, but the Duke stayed, gave him ballast, and then brought his grassroots organization to the table to help Pitt win elections and build power in Parliament. And all because Pitt had said, yes, he was going to put reform on the agenda. And so at that moment, Pitt does actually start formally trying to move forward, more suffrage bills, essentially, and try to move election reform forward. They fail, and Pitt is ultimately sort of put off of it by the king's disapproval of it. But in the process, they've kind of established a template for reform. And then the next, newcomer, Charles Grey, he's called, picks up the baton, and he literally brings a suffrage bill every single year from 1790 until 1830, when the Tory government collapses. He's suddenly prime minister now, Charles Grey is 30 years on, and he passes the reform bill, and he gets the abolition bill passed. Like, all the reform stuff goes through in a wave, but only because they've been literally doing it every single year without any guarantee of success.
And Earl Grey tea.
Right, Earl Grey tea, yeah.
You know his name because of Earl Grey tea. Yes, it's named after him.
So I'm going to ask another question before we open it up to the audience. How are we for time now? We started, what, about 6:30? I mean, 5:30? I'm sorry? Oh, okay. So one thing I learned from the book that I did not know was just how chaotic things were in England, even before the revolution. And a lot of it felt really familiar, but Riots in the streets. One riot, this came later, but I didn't realize the just vehement anti-Catholicism, particularly coming out of Scotland, right? And that was part of what undermined the Duke's reform agenda. And of course, it made me think about the US. I mean, over and over again, distrust has been fomented in government around race, right? So I just wonder if you thought about those parallels at all. The problem of faction and the fomenting of faction. Some people, I can't remember which one it was, but one of the Duke's former radical friends became his enemy just because he was mad because he wasn't the one who got this. But the problem of faction and the willingness of political people to try to gather power by dividing people in undermining democracy.
Yeah, no, I mean, so the congressman said that reading the book gave him a sense of relief. I mean, it gave me a sense of relief too, precisely because the politics were so horrible. And like, England's okay today, right? So,
well, I don't know.
I know it's true. It's a question mark. There's a question mark. And yes, I mean, there were positive forces and counter forces, very much active simultaneously. And so I think it comes back to the point the congressman made about stubbornness, and also the point about really sort of doing the work of building popular support for the positive and healthy directions. And of course, those anti-Catholic rioters consider themselves to be working in a positive direction. And that's always the challenge, right? And so how do you really kind of draw a line between, one scholar sort of juxtaposed the organizing the Duke and his colleagues were doing as the sort of forces of light to the kind of organizing that was coming out of Scotland as sort of forces of darkness, and they were colliding with each other in the very stormy period around 1780. I think it was ever thus, right, for the story of politics. And so in that regard, I think the history, cultivates a kind of sobering realism about politics. There isn't an arc of history bending towards justice. There is hard work that can pull things towards justice, and there are always also forces and factions that are trying to pull the other direction. So there's always a sort of tug of war, essentially.
Prologue with the mob at the gate of the legislature.
Right, exactly. January 6th.
They say what are the history rhymes?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's very, our committee was initially was set up for a year, and then it was extended to 2 years, and then it was extended for another 2 years. And the second extension happened on January 3rd, and we got a handful of new committee members. And then January 6th happened, and not great on one hand, my thought was, well, maybe this will put some wind at our back for reform. And I had one-on-one meetings with every member of the committee, including your old boss. And of the 12 members of the committee, 9 of them said, I don't think we're going to do anything. And I'm not sure I want to be in the room with the other party. And I remember saying to my chief of staff, I was like, we're hosed. We're just totally screwed, because how do you make reform with people who don't even want to get into the room? And we ended up doing something. I'm only sharing this because I thought maybe you'll find it interesting, and maybe it's slightly irrelevant, because the Duke kept focusing on reform rather than letting it lead to rupture or just throwing the white flag up. We did something that, to my knowledge, didn't happen anywhere else in Congress. We actually brought in an outside expert in conflict resolution, and we talked. We actually had a conversation about the 6th of January, and we just kind of talked through it, and it was raw and it was challenging. And then we actually did some things that were kind of that ended up being very different. If you watch one of the committee's hearings on C-SPAN, you have too much time on your hands. But if you watch one, you'll find a few things. Like, we didn't sit with Democrats on one side of the dais and Republicans on the other. We sat Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. Why? Well, when an interesting witness says something fascinating, like, my genetic predisposition is to lean over to the person next to me and say, hey, that was kind of interesting. What do you think about that? And in our committee, you leaned over to someone from the different party. We didn't even sit at a dais. We sat around a big round table. Why? I've never had a good conversation speaking to the back of somebody's head. We organized committee meals together. We had a committee retreat together where we actually talked through, Democrats and Republicans. Like, the first question we asked is, why did you come to Congress? And how has it met or failed to meet your expectations? And honestly, if you had been a fly on the wall, you wouldn't have known who the Democrats were and who the Republicans were. And so I share that with you because that kind of polarization that you spoke to, and division, whether it's division by race or division by party, or there are a lot of forces that try to divide us. And I think one of my takeaways from working on reform is that if you want things to work differently, do things differently.
Did you get some stuff done?
We passed 202 recommendations focused on making Congress work better. About 2/3 of them have been implemented. Now, there are a lot of big things that have not been done and that our committee didn't recommend because we couldn't get agreement on some of the big things, things like gerrymandering and money in politics, which I think are worthy of reform efforts. But, there were some things of significance and some things that may seem insignificant, but may make a difference later on. Can I give you an example?
Please do, yeah.
So I'll give you an example. So, and the genesis of this is actually kind of interesting. So we had a hearing on culture, and we invited in a political scientist, the guy who started Braver Angels, who was a minister, a marriage counselor. We brought in a management consultant. I thought about bringing in an exorcist, because like how do you, what do you do? Oh, and an organizational psychologist. And afterwards, the organizational psychologist said to me, I got a guy. He's like, I got a guy for you to talk to. I was like, tell me. And he was like, I want you to talk to this sports coach. And it was a football coach who, like, if any of you would know his name, but I promised I wouldn't say it. So I call up this coach. I said, Coach, how do you, he goes, first of all, I don't know anything about Congress. I said, I don't want to talk to you about Congress. I want to talk to you about culture. I said, what do you do when you got players on the team who are actively trying to sabotage the team? And he said, well, I cut them. It's like, we don't have that option. And he goes, I got a question for you. I said, shoot. He said, how do you do new player orientation? I said, that's really interesting. I said, we don't have new player. I said, we do have new Congress member orientation. He said, how's it work? I said, it's really funny you say that. I hadn't really thought about this, but it works entirely the wrong way. When I showed up to orientation, literally they were like, okay, Democrats, you go in that room. Republicans, you go in that room. The entire orientation process was designed to keep the two parties apart. And he goes, well, I don't know much about Congress, but it seems like you ought to stop doing that. And so one of our 202 recommendations was stop doing that. And this last year was the first congressional orientation that was bipartisan in more than 30 years. Wow. Now, that did not fix Congress overnight, right? I am not hanging the mission accomplished banner, right? But the notion that the relationships that new members form could maybe over time alter the trajectory, like, that matters.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that. Those are great examples. And it's true that in this period of reform, in the 1770s and early 1780s, that's what they did. They started picking off these like small things that were just about doing things differently. So, Burke and the Duke had a big legislative program around corruption and the like. But then when the Duke was Master General of the Ordnance, which is sort of roughly speaking Defense Secretary, he just plain cleaned house in his own agency. So it was that kind of, he did the reform that was within the reach, given where he was sitting. So can we ask the congressman, though, where he thinks reform should go from here?
Actually, yes. I was thinking about that, and I want to hear from you on that as well, because
I would like to put our
okay, let's go
here.
Well, I'm going to ground it in the book that you should all buy, because so much of the conversation was around legislative independence and legislative supremacy, right? And, you know, our founders chose the legislative branch as Article 1 of the Constitution for a reason, right? Was the premise was that we should have legislative supremacy, and for the last century, you've seen two forces that have like massively diminished that. One is Congress actively giving up authority. Every time it doesn't pass a spending bill and does continuing resolutions, every time it delegates decisions that Congress has authority to make, right? Like the separation of powers works if you presume that each of the branches will assert their prerogative and assert their own interest. The legislative branch is not doing that. It is choosing not to assert its interest. It is deferring. And then secondly, you have an executive branch that not just under this administration, but in modern history has consistently exercised its prerogative and taken power. You know, and this administration, and I'm only speaking on my own behalf, you know, has been much more active with that. You know, even when Congress has passed spending bills saying, well, we're not going to spend it, right? Like that, and we're going to spend it on something else. That is an example of this massive swing of power. And so to me, the focus has to be on restoring that balance. And
how?
So Princeton, I think, did something important, and it was led by a Republican, led by Mickey Edwards, who was a Republican from Oklahoma, a former member. He started the Heritage Foundation, taught at Princeton, and started something called the Article 1 Initiative at Princeton. And it focused on restoring Article 1 authorities around a few different things: on the power of the purse, on war powers, and on oversight of the executive. Like if you just started there, right? And some of this would require legislation, and it should require legislation. And I don't think this president is likely to sign anything that moves power back to the legislative branch. But this is one of those where I think, regardless of party, the notion of trying to re-empower the people's house is in the interest of the American public. And the American public, for that reform to happen, has to ask for it.
You have any thoughts? And then I want to open it up
Congress
to
has
the
to
audience.
decide it wants it, right? Congress has to say it wants that power back.
Which I sort of think Congress is afraid of. I'm curious what you think. That is to say that the internal workings of Congress have gotten so gummed up that my instinct is Congress is afraid to take power because it doesn't think it could actually wield it effectively. Is that crazy?
Well, so there's two things at play, right? So you think about like regulatory authority. So there's three things at play, right? So if you think about regulatory authority, what you've had is Congress saying, you know, we want to set this high, you know, this standard for pick your regular, you know, for clean air, and then it defers to the agency to figure out the details, right? Which is a way of saying we're going to give up power. Some of that is by choice. Some of that is by necessity, because Congress has self-lobotomized over the last 3 decades, right? It has divested itself of capacity, right? So one of the things that would have to happen is to, you know, if Congress was going to pass regulatory bills that said, and we're going to set the rules of what that looks like, think about the hiring that the legislative branch would have to do, that the knowledge that it would have to build, right? So some of it's by choice, some of it's by capacity. And there are some issues, and then third is there are some things that Congress ducks, right? I mean, when when President Obama was drew a red line in Syria, and then the red line was crossed, he said, well, I'm going to go to Congress. And Congress threw up its hands. And why did Congress throw up its hands? Because it didn't want to vote on it.
Yeah, we're skipping the elephant in the room. In this era, let's be honest, there's a cult of personality. Donald Trump is the titular head of the Republican Party. He takes prisoners for people who buck him. He finds candidates to get rid of members of Congress who don't toe the line. And part of this, I think, atrophying of them asserting the power they have is it not?
But in 1994, when Congress flipped, part of the contract with America basically said, we're going to cut Congress's budget.
I got it.
It was self-flagellation.
Right.
It said, and as a consequence, committee budgets were cut by between a third and a half.
I got it.
Right? Member office budgets were cut. And so when I talk about the self-lobotomy, that happened 30 years ago. It's still, if you put it at, if you accounted for inflation, Congress, the legislative branch, is still not, with one exception now, which is security.
They don't have the institutional capacity.
Have the institutional capacity that it had 30 years ago.
Okay.
And think about how much more complex the world is now. Right?
I really want the audience to get in here. So questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Marathon kind of out day we're handing courses off, knowing for sure to carry it on. But I'm curious how you think about measuring if we're going in the right direction, especially when we're often not getting to those in our lifetime, and how we think about whether or not, are we actually running down the track the right way to hand it off to the next person, or are we screaming to avoid as the ship slowly sinks? I'm curious how you think about that when you don't always get to see the consequences, how we know if we're headed in the right direction, if we know that what we're doing is different.
So that's a really important and powerful question. And I want to come back to the question that was raised before about sort of the Duke's failure at the end of his life on slavery. I mean, I think what happened to him was basically he came to believe that things were not headed in the right direction, despite all of his efforts. He just kind of gave up on the project altogether and abandoned the notion that you could make the world better in any way whatsoever. And, therefore just, gave his proxy to a kind of against an abolition opportunity. I say that because there are things one can try to track. You can always rate. Anybody who's got a theory of change lays out sort of indicators would count. How would you know if you're moving in the right direction? And I think if you're good at your work, you've got sort of good indicators, and they can indeed help you. But I think the actually more important thing is that it's not actually about the outcome. And this is the hard part. This is sort of the leap of faith part. It really is a question of, have you done what you could do given your resources and your circumstances, so that the pattern of your life is pulling in the right direction, and sort of back to like the forces of light versus forces of dark. Like that's what really matters. Does the pattern of your life pull in the direction of light? That's all we can evaluate. And we can evaluate that through the nature of our choices. And I think, so that's what I sort of would offer back.
Yes. I'm the lady, I'm going.
Can I say something about that real quick?
Uh-huh.
So one, you asked if the boat was going in the right direction. It's funny. I represented a Navy district, and I remember at Armed Forces Day, they had this admiral come talk, and he goes, "Hey, how's it going in Congress, man?" And I said, it feels like trying to like turn a battleship. And he said, "Well, I actually captained a battleship." And he said, "Here's what I'll tell you: targeted and strategic course correction over time can make a really big difference." And I was like, "I'm totally stealing that, dude." And candidly, I've grappled with this question myself, right? Like we spent I spent 4 years chairing a committee. We spent a few years with a subcommittee of House administration, continuing to work on reform. And Congress is less popular now than it's ever been, and less popular than headlights, colonoscopy, and the rock band Nickelback. And I'm like, I don't know, was that all worth it? And I like to hope that it was worth it. And I'd like to hope that that things will get better, because there's a bunch of people pushing to make it better.
My example is the abolitionists. Many of them died long before it happened, but they fought the fight that was right for them, and there's dignity in the fight in their time. And had they not, the next generation might not have. Yes, your question.
I am struck in this transatlantic context. I would feel to me like a missing piece of friendship. And if ever there was a radical movement, that's it. And so obviously that was a moment of representation, of the universal representation, long before it became codified into law, either in England, and it didn't go so far. So I'm wondering what the Duke and obviously Burke took a lesson, which I feel like I need to know more about early Burke, but I know Burke, reflections on the revolution. I'm interested in what the Duke made of that experience. And the other thing is, I was so struck listening to you reading that very long sentence with its momentum towards this creation of a participatory form of government, by how different that is from our experience, and how few Americans, I think, view themselves as bound in contract in a way that the founding fathers imagined. And I just wonder whether, is that contract working for the success of democracy? Does one simply have to accept that contract, that kind of bound contract is not?
So I've heard three questions. Listen, you have the French Revolution, the Duke's response to it, and then this idea of the idealistic social contract participation in democracy when you don't have that. Okay. We're going to try to do lightning rounds. I want more questions before we.
I will try. Okay. So maybe on the French Revolution, we sort of talked about the first half of the book, and then the second half of the book has a lot of the French Revolution in it. And the Duke's early friendship with Paine ends up being a very dramatic rupture. I will spare you the details. And the French Revolution is the kind of catalyst for the rupture. So I'll give you that for the moment. On the other point, no, I don't think we have to give up on the contract idea or a sort of sense of kind of civic covenant that we might have with each other. I take the reform project to be as much about a culture project as about an institutional project. Just as inside Congress, it was as much culture, it sounds like, as institutions. And so I would say, you're all invited. You're all join me in re-engaging with the civic covenant. And what does that mean exactly? This is what I'm trying to figure out. This is why my question for you is what comes next. I think for a lot of the institutional reformers, the work was pushing inside institutions. We didn't build a movement, sort of outside of institutions. But that is really what is needed. And so, yes, I do think that the culture of self-government in this country is atrophied, that people don't have it sort of in their soul and spirit, sort of what that means to live as a sort of self-governing person. And so that's the thing I kind of, rack my brains about all the time, is how to kind of reanimate that for people. I spent a lot of time talking to rooms of people and asking them to close their eyes and consider a moment when they felt free. try to identify a moment in their life, a thing that they did where they felt free, and tell themselves the story of that, tell it to a neighbor, and then try to consider and what emotions came with that experience. Was that a good experience? Was it a scary experience? Like what was freedom actually like in your life? Do you want more of it? Okay, if you want more of it, which is usually the answer, that people do want more of that feeling once they identify it, then okay, how are we going to have more of that? So literally at that sort of way of trying to work and recover this actual sort of spiritual feeling of what it means to kind of orient towards steering your own life and actually genuinely fully experiencing freedom.
You've been trying to get in here, sir. Yes, you.
What was perhaps special about early life? How did he become radical or radical kind of person? And the question of in terms of the causality of what you see as the driving forces behind this, what you call memorably self-robot language, that a sort of pressure in political culture around the government that legislature taking on this one instead of does create kind of backlash against it. Where does that kind of come from? It seems like it's a really complex question about with many different, but just your kind of thoughts on that. You can
Go first this time.
I think at some point there was a diagnosis that you could score political points by attacking government, by saying, if you've got a problem, it's because of government, and that government's not working for you. So it became a winner politically to say, if government's the problem, the solution clearly is cutting government. And you see that with the changes that were made in the 90s around funding of committees, eliminating the Office of Technology Assessment, all of these things that just reduce the capacity of government to deliver more. So it becomes this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. When I became chair of this committee, someone gave me a graduation speech from John Gardner, who'd been the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare for Lyndon Johnson. And he talked about the importance, he talked about declining faith in institutions in the 60s, by the way. And then he talked about the importance of institutional stewardship. And he said institutions suffer from two things. He said they suffer from uncritical lovers, people who deny an institution the sort of life-giving eye toward improvement that's necessary. And secondly, they suffer from unloving critics who treat the institution like the piñata at the party and only seek to tear it down. And I'll tell you, like that, treating the institution like the piñata, ask any member of Congress, the most popular message when they poll is Congress is broken. I mean, to this day, one of the most depressing things to me was the most popular thing I did in 12 years of office was when there was a government shutdown, I gave up my own pay. And I felt like if my constituents weren't getting paid, I represented a bunch of public workers that I shouldn't get paid. But that was the most popular thing I did, in part because it was self-flagellatory, right? And so what John Gardner said was institutions need loving critics. That's what stewardship's about. And I think that's true for all of us as Americans, right? President Kennedy said we all hold office. In this country, we all hold office as citizens. And so the question is, like, do we do that through the lens of being loving critics of the institutions, or do we just turn a blind eye toward it, or do we beat the stuffing out of it?
You want to answer the final question, and then I think we'll have the reception.
Okay, well, so the Duke became a Duke when he was 15. He was orphaned at that age. First his father died, and then his mother. So, and just before his father died, he had determined to send him to the continent for a grand tour because he had far too much interest in young women. And so there was like, what happens in Europe stays in Europe was basically the line of thinking. And so, whereas most aristocrats went on grand tour at the time for like a year or maybe two, and then they came to Oxbridge, he went for 5 and he never went to Oxbridge. So that was already taking him sort of out of the circle of his peers. And then in Europe, 2 really important things happened for him. One was the visit with his dad's good old friend, Montesquieu, which sort of opened up a kind of philosophical education. The second was he had his own, from childhood, interest in military affairs. Now, normally it's the second son who would be sent off to gain military training in a military position, but he had enough of an interest in it himself. He just actually wanted that. And so he secured himself a military tutor. And in the process of doing that, he ended up in a very close relationship with somebody named General James Wolfe, ultimately very famous for winning the Battle of Quebec for the British. Wolfe was himself deeply committed to Enlightenment philosophy. He had all of his soldiers reading Enlightenment philosophy. And they would say about him, he gave me liberal notions of every kind. So he had these 2 people who were his real teachers, actually, in a context, again, where he didn't go to Oxbridge. And Wolfe, in addition to being interested in Enlightenment philosophy, had a very kind of stern critique of the corruption of the British government. So corruption through patronage, corruption through cronyism, corruption through not seeing talent in the sort of working orders of the population. And Richmond clearly imbibed all of that because he sort of had a long correspondence with Wolfe that then, the language in that, which was this long conversation about corruption, starts to flow into all of his other sort of thinking and writing.
I just want to thank both of you. This has been a very stimulating conversation. I could have continued forever. Thank you for coming. Happy
you all.
Juneteenth.
I need everybody needs to.